What is up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Commissioner's Office Podcast. My name is Daniel. Thank you all for tuning in to the return of the pod. It has been a while since my last episode. I believe that one came out in late May or April, something like that. It was a pretty good episode, and continuing with the kind of general feel of the last episode where we were talking about baseball, we're talking about baseball again because not much is going on in terms of football, which is what the majority of my episodes I think have been about. So, as my listeners probably know, I'm from the Chicago area, and I'm a Cubs fan. And I was once a very proud Cubs fan, as they were very good. Won that World Series back in 2016. But since then, I feel like it's just been like nothing but disappointment and pain because the Cubs just have not really been able to be very good over the past couple years. And now they're 30-46 at the time of recording this. They're not contending, and the management has insisted that another long rebuild is not coming right now, and they still have confidence in our manager, David Ross. However, what happened to this team? They still have some good pieces, but clearly they were not as good as they were like 3 years ago. And compared to other teams that kind of came up around the same time that the Cubs did, like the Astros or the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Brewers, the Cubs collapsed before like anyone else. All four of those teams that I mentioned are still competitive. Meanwhile, the Cubs really are not. So what I'd like to do in this episode is examine why did the Cubs even decline in the first place? And, what happened to this team? Why did they not get back to that World Series? And so when I was kind of scripting this episode, I stumbled upon kind of the list of the top 10 Cubs players from 2016 in terms of WAR. Now, WAR is a very fancy analytical baseball statistic that you can no doubt impress your friends and family with, that is short for wins above replacement. It's basically a cumulative stat that shows your value. Now, for example, I think Mike Trout, who's the best player in the league, would accrue 10 WAR in a very good season of his. So that's MVP level, right? And I think, if you have a WAR above 0 at the end of the season or wherever the season, that means you're above replacement level. If you have a WAR below 0 or negative, then you're below replacement level. So, in terms of WAR, from 2016, the championship squad for the Cubs, the highest accruing Cubs players were as follows: Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, John Lester, Kyle Hendricks, Jake Arrieta, Dexter Fowler, Addison Russell, Ben Zobrist, Javi Baez, and John Lackey. Those were the 10. And now, when you look at that list, I think for the most part, it's not a terrible assessment that those might have been the 10 best players on the team. Yeah, you could throw in maybe someone like Wilson Contreras, who kind of emerged halfway through the season, and since WAR is, like I said, a cumulative stat, probably didn't have that much WAR. Aroldis Chapman's another one, but, relievers and closing pitchers aren't, you don't really look at WAR when evaluating how valuable a player they were. So Aroldis Chapman definitely was a top 10 player on that Cubs team, but in terms of WAR, you're not going to find that. But in terms of a measurable statistic among all of these players, such as wins above replacement, I think that's a pretty comprehensive list. So, after the championship team, logic would kind of point to saying, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Cubs should keep everyone from the championship team, at least for a couple years, and see if they can replicate their previous successes. So, did the Cubs keep all of these guys? And if they didn't, what happened to them? Let's jump right into it. So the one thing that I think made the Cubs such a good team, especially in 2016 and kind of the years surrounding and before, was that they had a very experienced and talented rotation of starting pitching. But the problem with that was that they couldn't really replicate the 2016 seasons after. For example, John Lester and Jake Arrieta had a couple of good seasons after the World Series, and they had some good performances here and there. John Lester pitched really well in the 2018 wildcard game versus Colorado. I think he went like 6 innings of like 1 run ball. And for the record, they should have won that game. That's probably the saltiness coming out for a second. Jake Arrieta had a really good performance in Game 4 of the 2017 NLCS versus the Dodgers. That was the year where they were on the verge of being swept, and then at home, you just knew they weren't going to get swept because Wilson Contreras hit like a 490-foot home run, and you're like, okay, they're pushing this to 5. They didn't last longer than 5 games, but we can just, go around that. But still, the point here I'm making is that Lester and Arrieta, they were, the two like big like columns in the rotation, but they still just kind of really like drifted off after 2016. John Lackey, another guy in the starting rotation, he was pretty good in 2016, especially he was a 4th starter because they had Jason Hamill as the 5th starter. That's a name to remember. But John Lackey, not very good in 2017, even for someone who was not an ace. Any Cubs fan is probably remembers he gave up a walk-off home run to Justin Turner in the NLCS 2017. And I'm sorry, Cubs fans, for bringing that one back into your mind. John Lackey, if there's anything I remember from that 2017 season, he would give you like 4 or maybe 5 good innings of pitching, but then completely imploded in the 6th inning, the 5th inning, kind of halfway through the game, usually around the 3rd time through the order, which granted is what plagues a lot of pitchers, but for him it was just very like, you knew it was going to happen. And so, nonetheless, these 3 guys were all gone within the next 4 years, which to me makes sense. They were older. All of those guys were in their 30s when they left. John Lackey, I think, was like 37. John Lester was like 39. Jake Arrieta was mid-30s. They were older and they weren't pitching well, so it made sense. John Lackey retired, and John Lester, they just like kind of cut, and then Jake Arrieta, they let walk. So that makes sense why they let them go. So that makes sense why they let those pitchers go. But this absence of the older pitchers reveals the first problem with the Cubs after the World Series. Problem number 1, they failed to develop and or sign younger starters. I feel like this has like always been their problem. There are many problems, as we're going to examine, but this is a big one because pitching is so important in baseball, even in today's baseball landscape where there's juiced balls and like everyone is hitting homers and or striking out and like blah blah blah, everyone's scoring runs. You still need good starting pitching because, especially in the postseason, that makes a lot more of a difference because you're always playing against the best pitchers. But between 2017 and 2020, we saw guys like Eddie Butler and Tyler Chatwood and like Dwayne Underwood and Adbert Alzolay, who's still with the team, but I think he's injured. Those guys have all tried to get in the rotation. They signed Chatwood. Butler and Underwood and Alzolay were top pitchers in the farm system for a while. These guys were all players who were at one time promising, but never really panned out. I wouldn't say the book is absolutely closed on Adbert Alzolay yet because he showed some flashes of being pretty solid in the last couple seasons, but he keeps getting injured. So we'll see what happens. He's still pretty young, but still, those guys never really panned out. Now, the front office was aware of this, so to try to alleviate this problem, they kind of tried to replicate what they did in 2016, but exactly the same way. So instead of kind of mixing the youth and the veterans, they just kind of added a lot more veterans to the squad, which, in my opinion, is always going to be a very high risk, high reward move. Now, a lot of people talk about the bullpen being bad for Chicago, and it was at some points. Like at various streaks in the season, they'd be really bad. The Cubs were very streaky after the World Series, but at least they got good seasons out of guys like Wade Davis and like Kyle Ryan, who was like the lefty specialist for Joe Madden before the MLB implemented the the three batters rule. Craig Kimbrell had like one good season, and they turned him into Nick Madrigal and Cody Hoyer with that trade with the Sox. Alec Mills threw a no-hitter. You had Steve Cishek, who was pretty solid. Brandon Morrow, who was on fire as our closer before he like put his pants on the wrong way and then like strained his back and never played for us again. That beats me how that happened. Mike Montgomery got the final out in the World Series, and he was still pretty good the next couple of years. He was a good long relief guy. So the Cubs were at least able to have kind of a makeshift bullpen for a while. But as I mentioned before, the starters that they signed were usually on the wrong side of 30 and just not at the top of their game. We saw like they traded for Cole Hamels in 2018, which proved to not be a terrible signing. He was pretty good for the Cubs, but again, Cole Hamels was like a World Series MVP in 2009, so kind of past his prime. They shelled out all that money for Yu Darvish, and it took him like 3 seasons for him to kind of live up to that contract. But still, it didn't really all gel at the same time. And now the efforts to bolster the starting rotation also kind of exposed another problem within the organization itself. And that was bad trades. So right there, you got, they couldn't like get the starting rotation right after the World Series, and in an effort to alleviate that problem, they made bad trades. And this spread to messing up the hitting core as well. Like, for example, after the World Series, they let Aroldis Chapman walk. He signed with the Yankees. There's this big thing where they're like, oh my gosh, he wants $100 million. How are we ever going to pay him? And then he signed with the Yankees for like $85 million, and like he was fine. They had to fill the closer spot because Aroldis Chapman wasn't there anymore. So the Cubs went out and traded for Wade Davis from the Kansas City Royals in the offseason. And that was the right move. I remember seeing that trade as I was walking out of middle school, and I was like, oh, who'd they give up? It was just a 1-for-1 trade. They gave up Jorge Soler, who was their big bench bat, and in that time there was no universal DH. Soler was like pretty good in right field. He had a good arm, but like whatever, the Royals could use him more as a DH. So I was like, okay, that's a good trade for both sides. We get our closer, they get a good bench bat, like fine. And it worked for us in 2017. Wade Davis was fantastic. He pitched, lights out. He got the save in Game 5 of the NLDS versus the Nationals. But then after one season, they just let him go. And he signed with the Rockies, and he put up like one good season and then kind of fell off. He was another older player, but still, it's kind of this thing where like they're just kind of letting people walk and not really showing a lot of like effort to replace players either with the same caliber at all. If you're a loyal listener to this show, you've known how much it makes me mad when like the Bears, for example, have a really good player and that they don't want to pay, so they let him walk and don't sign anyone in replacement. Like Allen Robinson comes to mind for the Bears. Not like paying him is one thing, but then not replacing anyone with him, not replacing him with anyone is another thing. So the Cubs kind of did a similar thing with a couple players, but that's different. We're talking about trades here, right? They traded 2 players, actually 4 players, but 2 very notable players for Jose Quintana that was 2018 at the deadline. That was a crosstown trade with the White Sox. And so they traded two big players for Jose Quintana, two top prospects in the organization. Jose Quintana was a solid pitcher, but they wanted him to be the ace, and he never really found his footing on the Cubs, nor, and I'm sorry to say this, Jose Quintana, but like was never that good of a player on the Sox. He showed flashes, but like I think in his first start for the Cubs, he struck out like 13 batters, and we're like, okay, this is a good trade, but he never replicated that. And so like it just wasn't a good trade at the time, and now that trade looks even worse. You want to know the two guys that they gave to the Sox for Jose Quintana? Eloy Jimenez and Dylan Cease. Those were the two big prospects. They were big prospects then, and they are probably going to be superstars now. Eloy keeps getting hurt. I hope he comes back healthy because he's really good, and Dylan Cease just haunts us every time he pitches against the Cubs. So that trade was bad. Again, they're kind of like, they were getting desperate for the rotation, so they threw a lot of their prospects for Quintana, which when you're contending, I understand the value in that, but I think they could have gotten something different. The Jose Quintana trade was also in 2017, not in 2018. What was in 2018, though, was this isn't a bad trade, but this is a trade that did not happen. So we've already established that the Cubs traded for Cole Hamels in 2018. It wasn't a terrible move, but they could have traded for a guy named Justin Verlander at that same deadline, who at the time was struggling with the Tigers, who he'd been with his entire career, and the Astros landed him. And, Justin Verlander has just continued to tear up the league, even though he's like in his late 30s and had a Tommy John surgery. They took Cole Hamels instead. Again, not a bad move, but like when Justin Verlander's there, I feel like you kind of have to trade for him. So there is two big problems there. The starters never came back to form, and they could not replace the starters and lost a lot of their farm system with the trades that they made. But back to the question of the Cubs core. So out of the 10 top guys in terms of WAR that I established earlier in the episode, there are 6 that remain. Rizzo, Bryant, Baez, Zobrist, Russell, and Fowler. A couple of good players right there. Now, here's the thing. Not all of this is like a heinous mistake on the Cubs. There are definitely things that the front office just like, I think anyone would it's not even a mistake, but just like this would happen to any front office. For example, I'll give the organization a pass for getting rid of Addison Russell. To be fair, Addison Russell kind of got rid of himself. He had a lot of off-the-field issues. Whatever, that was a pretty big story in Chicago. You can look it up. And besides, Javi Baez was proving to be the better player and turned out to be a better shortstop. Ben Zobrist, another guy in terms of WAR, who was in the top 10, I think also gets a pass from the organization. He was a really solid signing coming over from the Royals, had a lot of championship experience. Obviously, he was the World Series MVP. He had the big hit, yada, yada, yada. And they kept him after 2016. They still had his contract. He was still there for like 3 more seasons. But again, he had a couple of good seasons, but he missed a lot of time for like a really weird reason. Like, again, this is another very like famous story that probably, unfortunately for him, should have not been super famous, was that he had like a really messy divorce, and that kind of like forced him to leave the team, and it took him a while for him to come back, and then he retired. So that kind of, slowed down his career trajectory, which again was already on the decline because he was in his late 30s, but still that kind of like messed it up. Now, side note, I think I saw Ben Zobrist back at Wrigley a couple weeks ago. It looks like he's doing great. Good for him, but that's unfortunate. But those two guys, Russell and Zobrist, okay, whatever. That's not organization's fault, right? There are 4 more players left from the 2016 squad that we mentioned earlier, and one of them was Dexter Fowler. He was the Cubs center fielder, and he was the leadoff man. And after 2016, they lost Fowler to the Cardinals. Now, granted, he was 30 at the time, and he signed a contract that was $82 million over, I think, 5 years. That's a steep contract for a 30-year-old, and Dexter Fowler was by no means a superstar. I think he was an all-star once in his career, and that was the 2016 season. But you're telling me that he didn't want to stay with the Cubs after they just won the World Series and he signed with a division rival? Like, I just feel like that in itself was like, they could have brought him back on like a 2-year deal with like a little bit more money, and it would have been fine. Now, this absence from Dexter Fowler revealed kind of a lesser known but still like massive problem with the team. They couldn't find a leadoff hitter after 2016. The Cubs literally threw everything at the wall and like nothing stuck. Starting after 2016, they brought in Jon Jay, who was ironically a former Cardinal, and he actually was, I liked Jon Jay. He was a good center fielder. He was a pretty good leadoff guy. The stats on Jon Jay are like, in his 2017 season, are not like super spectacular. Pulling them up now. I mean, he batted .296, had a .374 OBP, slugged .375, had a .749 OPS, and only 2 homers and 34 RBIs, 6 stolen bases, and he played in 141 games. Like, those stats are pretty good. Nothing crazy, but he would always give you a good at-bat. He walked a fair amount. I think that it was a step in the right direction, at least, to have Jay on the team. I mean, he walked 8.6% of the time, which was a career high. So we got a good season out of Jon Jay. He always got on base, especially in the postseason. He was pretty solid. So 2017, good job, front office bringing him in. Since 2018, though, still, they haven't been able to find anyone. And again, when Joe Maddon was still the manager, they were like really thinking out of the box to try to find someone. So they started off with traditional contact guys like Albert Almora, who scored the go-ahead run in the World Series, great fielder, first-round pick. Actually was pretty solid in 2018. He batted .333 when leading off, according to Fangraphs. But I guess they just decided he wasn't good enough, so that stopped. And they literally put every single person you could think of on those Cubs teams at the leadoff position. They'd put Kyle Schwarber. They'd put Ian Happ, Wilson Contreras. Chris Bryant got a couple leadoff games. Jason Hayward. But they weren't actually addressing the problem. I feel like just like reason will tell you, when you put that many guys on your team, who most of them are power hitters at the leadoff position, I think it's fair to say you need to address the problem with bringing in someone from another team, which I don't understand why they never wanted to do that. Now, Kyle Schwarber and Ian Happ, when they batted leadoff, they would always give you a good at-bat. Like, that's fine. Ian Happ has proved to be pretty good. Kyle Schwarber obviously has the power, but they didn't really get on base enough, nor were they super fast. And that doesn't really make any sense. They tried Anthony Rizzo at leadoff for a while, which, granted, if you guys remember those old teams, Rizzo batting leadoff was always a giant meme because he's like the greatest leadoff hitter of all time. He'd always hit a home run, to lead off the game. But then they just kind of kept doing it, and it kind of wore off the sheen of him being really good at leadoff. And then it just didn't make any sense because Rizzo was the chief RBI man, and putting him at leadoff doesn't make any sense. So you can put him there for one game, but then realize this is the guy you want hitting 100 RBIs in the season, so you can't put him at the one spot. And I think that this stat that I'm about to say kind of sums up their struggles. From 2019 to 2021, the leadoff man for the Cubs batted .228 and had an OBP of 314. Not really good numbers. Dexter Fowler, in comparison, surpassed those numbers in both his years in Chicago, 2015 and 2016. And he surpassed them by 20 to 30 points. OBP is on base percentage as well. So that's not good. You need a good leadoff man to continue to, keep the offense going. The Cubs relied a lot on home runs towards the end of their contending run, which in of itself is not terrible because the game was moving towards being more home run centric. But when you're not getting in and one on base, and when your pitching is that fragile in the amount of talent it has, it's not going to work. So the leadoff man, big problem. All right, so going back to that list of top guys in terms of WAR from 2016, if you guys can remember, that leaves Bryant, Rizzo, and Baez. The big three, that's the core right there. After the World Series, Rizzo has been around for a while, but coincidentally, him and Bryant and Baez's contracts, which were rookie contracts, were all kind of starting to end in a couple years. All three expressed interest that they wanted to stay with the Cubs, but by halfway through 2021, they were all gone. And I think that this reveals another big problem here, number 4, and that it's the Ricketts' refusal to really spend money. Now, a lot of people say that's not true. The Cubs are a big market team. They gave all that money to Yu Darvish and Kyle Hendricks and Jason Hayward. And that's true. I'm not denying the fact that the Ricketts have spent money, but consider this. It's the MLB doesn't have a hard salary cap. So the salary cap, I think I've explained this a couple times, but salary cap is literally how much money you can have for the team as a payroll. And the MLB doesn't have that like the NFL or the NBA. And the salary cap raises, usually increases or decreases over time, but the MLB doesn't really have that. So this creates this paradox where it's if you live in a city that's in a big market, like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, you're probably going to have a lot more money to spend than teams in smaller markets like Milwaukee or Oakland or something like that. The Cubs are in a big market. The Cubs have always had a lot of money, at least since the Ricketts have owned the team. The Ricketts are very, very wealthy. So, in theory, if your franchise is successful and brings in a lot of money, you can spend essentially whatever you want. That's why the Dodgers always seemingly have enough cap space for another max contract, That's why they're always able to sign Freddie Freeman and Trevor Bauer and trade for Max Scherzer and all that jazz. But the problem is the Ricketts just never really kind of kept that pace going. And, I understand that Rizzo and Bryant and Baez, they really didn't have great production after the World Series. Baez had his MVP caliber season in 2018, and Rizzo kind of kept it up, but they're all kind of on slow declines. Doesn't mean they were bad, but it doesn't mean they were as good as 2016. But even if that's true, which it is, the front office would have at least traded the core while they still had more value if they really didn't want them there. That's why I consider the problem of not spending enough money to be an ownership problem rather than a front office problem. Because if Jed Hoyer and then Theo Epstein really didn't want the core there, they would be smart enough to trade them before their contracts expired, so at least they would get better players for them. You kind of following me here? They're doing the same thing with Wilson Contreras right now. They're kind of saying, both parties are saying that they want to come to an agreement on a contract, but the Cubs are just not signing him. I mean, they almost got pushed to offering him arbitration for his next contract, and arbitration is kind of a mess, but it's basically just once you get to a certain amount of time played in the majors, you either have a choice. You can try to negotiate a contract with your team, or if you do not come to an agreement with your team, then like a third party intervenes and decides your contract for you. If you get to that point, like where that has to happen, there is some serious disconnect between the two parties. And there shouldn't be, because both parties want him to stay. Right? So I think lately it's just kind of seemed like that the Cubs are just making these like surface level signings just to keep the team like functioning. Like in 2020, their big offseason signing was Jock Peterson, which was like on a 1 year, like $6 million deal. And they traded him by June for like one prospect in Double-A. Like this year, they brought in Marcus Stroman on a pretty hefty contract. But, you know, again, it's not like... it's not really... They're not making signings that like instills confidence in the team. Like they're not making signings that are like, ooh, this is a very like analytically smart signing, you know, so maybe it's under the radar, but this guy should be good. And it's not like, ooh, they are going to go grab like, you know, the best player on the market. It's just kind of like somewhere in the middle, you know? And I know they paid $75 million for Seiya Suzuki, which is like a lot of money, but he's a completely different case because he played overseas. That's a different market, different circumstances, whatever. And I think this is kind of the problem, is that, in my opinion, the Ricketts are more focused on running their business and their entrepreneurial, you know, things that they're doing rather than, you know, seeing a successful Cubs team. And this can reflect in that a lot of people aren't going to Cubs games anymore. The seats are not as packed as they were when they were good. Which doesn't make any sense, because even in like 2019, when the team was not as good, they still were filling up the stadium. And the Cubs have a loyal fan base, and Wrigley Field is very nice. Like, they will fill the stadium if they want to. But I think the fans are kind of realizing that, like, the Ricketts just don't really seem to be very interested in the well-being of the team, just as long as they're profitable. Also, the way that the Cubs organization as a whole has kind of treated the players like Rizzo and Baez and Contreras and Bryant, not only is it's just not a very good look for the team. Like, what does it say to me that like the three most beloved players in Cubs history since like Ernie Banks played were either lowballed or either showed such little interest in re-signing that they signed with Detroit and Colorado, two teams that are currently in the middle of a rebuild. Like, that's the thing that gets me about the organization sometimes, is that they have this very loyal fan base, they play in a very iconic stadium, they have a likable team, and they have the resources to contend, but like something is just holding them back from wanting to do it. Like, there was a quote from Anthony Rizzo after he was traded, where he said, like, I think they asked him about the Cubs not doing super well, and he basically said, like, oh, if they wanted to contend, they could. Which I think he's right. Like, say what you want about how the Dodgers just throw money at people, but at least they're still good, and they have been good for the past 10 years. You know, and it's like, I think that's kind of a little bit of an issue, is that they need to change the way they look at the team, not just as a business venture, but as entertainment for the city of Chicago. And you can make your entertainment better if you increase the quality of the team, which again, it's not an exact science, but the lack of effort that has been shown is something that I think is affecting the fan base and interest in the team. You know, on paper, the team still isn't even that bad. And I think that a lot of the problems that plagued the Cubs in 2016 were either really hard to predict or just plain, like, unlucky. Like, but still, I still think that there were things that we've established, like the bad trades, like the lack of interest in re-signing their players, like not finding a leadoff hitter. Those were kind of things that they could have done to contend further. All right, well, that is going to conclude another episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed, please make sure to check out the page on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'm trying to consistently upload some more episodes now that I'm off school for the summer. If you know me personally and you have an episode idea, please reach out. I am always looking for new content. And thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time.